Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Monash Matters, and the world matters in this case because we have with us today Dr. David Bell, all the way from Texas, but originally from Foster. So there's a real connection here to South Gippsland and to Gippsland as a whole and the nation. David, would you like to give us just a bit of background before we go into what we're here to talk about today?
Yeah, okay, and thanks for having me on, Russell. And for your interest in this field, which is not that common among politicians, at least not vocally. I'm originally from Foster, as you mentioned. Actually, Foster Consolidated School, Foster High School, as it was then. Trained in medicine, and I worked in various jobs, but it basically went into public health. Infectious diseases, modelling of diseases, etc. Worked for the World Health Organization for about 8-9 years in the regional office in Manila and then in Geneva. And for Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics, which is a large sort of foundation working on diagnostics for low-income countries, and then for a Bill Gates lab in Seattle called Global Good Fund, where I was Director of Health Technologies. So I've, more or less working in sort of global health, low-income country public health, international organizations in health and in technology development and how it applies to that. So that's sort of my last 25, 30 years.
Fantastic. And you're currently in Texas, but most of your work is done for the University of Leeds.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Fantastic. David, we're looking at an article here from May 24 from Adam Crichton, who's been a shining light all the way through this whole process. He's been an absolute star, and he's paid a very heavy price for it with an enormous amount of criticism and even threats to his life and his family's life. He had to get out of Australia at one stage. And he mentions you in this article. Look, I wonder whether you just talk about pandemics for us and the fact that we're being told, the public are being told, get ready for the next pandemic. It's coming. It's on its way. It's bird flu. It's X flu. It's this flu. It's that flu, but it's coming. So be scared, be afraid, because here we are. Fear is fear. You should fear this greatly. Now, it's pretty clear from the article and some articles I've read recently that some of these pandemics aren't as bad as they're put up to be. But I'll hand over to you and just take me through that pandemic process that we've just been through.
Okay, yeah. First, maybe we define pandemic, and it's there's a few different definitions, but it's basically an infectious disease that is not normal, is well above normal levels, and it crosses country borders. So that's what a pandemic is. So you can have a pandemic of rhinovirus, which causes common colds. And lots of people in different countries will get colds, and that's a pandemic. The last really serious pandemic the world faced that killed a lot of people, had a big impact on mortality, was about a bit over 100 years ago, the Spanish flu, where, a recombination of influenza virus, probably from birds, swine, and humans, formed a virus that could be for a year or two quite bad in humans. But most people, even then, they died. It's over 100 years ago. We didn't have antibiotics, and most people died because they got the flu, they got a secondary bacterial infection. There was no modern medicine, no antibiotics, and they died. So we wouldn't expect that to happen again. There was a flu, we called a pandemic, in the late 50s, one in the late 60s, where about double the normal number of people who died from flu each year died. And then, nothing really until, people talk about SARS, for instance, SARS-1. There was 800 people died in the whole world in 2003. To put that in context, that is how many people die of tuberculosis in about 6 hours every day, every 6 hours of every day of the year. So that was a very small outbreak. These things happen all the time. You get small outbreaks here and there. 60, 70 years ago, we didn't notice them because communications were good and we couldn't detect them. Just some people got a funny illness, pneumonia, died, in a little patch somewhere, and then it went away, which is probably what SARS-1 would have done. So since the 1960s, but particularly since about 1980, 1983, when we invented PCR tests, we've been much, much better at detecting different pathogens, different viruses. So now we can detect, and we have a huge effort out there, which is growing at the moment greatly, to detect these new viruses as soon as they pop up. And instead of them causing a few people to get sick somewhere, and then it goes away, now we can make a big thing of it, because we have the ability to distinguish these from other viruses. People have heard of Nipah virus in Malaysia in 1999. That was one that came from fruit bats there. And they thought it was Japanese encephalitis, but because the CDC had new PCR tests, they managed to distinguish it. It's a new virus, so it's a new disease. Doesn't mean the disease is emerging. We hear all the time about emerging infectious diseases. Very rare for, variants of influenza can emerge. We get new ones all the time. But overall, it's very unusual for a completely new disease to emerge. We get variants that we can detect, and we can detect more viruses from other viruses. So we're getting better at detecting these things. And we're getting better at treating them, actually. So we have an increase in the number of reported outbreaks over the last 40 years, which has actually reduced over the last 10 years. And people are saying this is evidence of an increasing risk, but it's actually overwhelmingly evidence that we're getting much better. We're inventing new ways to detect and distinguish between small outbreaks of illness, which is normal for 8 billion people. So then COVID came along, and it's another coronavirus. It's highly likely it's due to manipulation in a laboratory, which I think still isn't infiltrating Australia, but the rest of the world, people sort of accept this now. And however it originated, escaped, it killed people on average at an age of about 80, almost always when they were very sick already with diabetes, obesity, renal failure, etc. Very rarely affected fit, healthy people. So in the past, this would have been a bad outbreak of pneumonia in elderly people, especially in nursing homes where they're close together, etc., and especially people who are already sick. So, we could have treated it. There are certain treatments that have some effect, and we could have normalized vitamin D, which would absolutely have an effect, etc., improve nutrition. But we didn't. We just threw up our hand, said it's a virus we'd never seen before, although we know a lot about coronaviruses. And there's nothing we can do unless they get really sick. We put a tube down their throat, which we knew was very dangerous for frail old people. So, in New York, for instance, where the highest mortality was initially early 2020, about 90% of people in Northwell Health, which is the biggest health service in New York, who were intubated, died. Because if you intubate old people, they die very often, because it's very hard to get a frail elderly person often intubated once you paralyze them and so on. So, the treatment of COVID has improved, but it's gone back to what we already knew. So we had deaths of the elderly from COVID. We had deaths of the elderly from the way that we managed the disease, and there is a lot of reasons for that. Most of them not very good ones. And, now it's sort of, for most of the world, it's sort of gone away. It's gone into the background. It's another coronavirus. We now have immunity, as we did for the other coronaviruses. So it's not going to be very bad anymore. But during that, rather than treating it as other outbreaks, it was treated as this sort of existential threat. We were locked down, which we knew would be extremely harmful economically, and health is tied to economy, so we knew it would be harmful health-wise. And then some people, the people who were actually pushing the lockdowns very hard, were behind a vaccine which made an unprecedented amount of money. So through this mechanism, we concentrated wealth to a level that hasn't happened in human history before, from the majority to a minority who were heavily
Correct.
invested in pharma. Yeah,
Absolutely correct.
so these companies made hundreds of billions of dollars, which they had never done before, unprecedented profits. And so it proved a model that you can take a relatively innocuous virus for most people. It wasn't for everyone, but for the vast majority of the population. And you can monetize it to a huge extent by manipulating through the media, through governments, etc., and using fear to a very large extent. And there are behavioral psychology units whose job was to instill fear in, and even though it's not necessarily nefarious what they did in a way, they were told this was a very bad virus. Your job is to instill fear, to force people to sort of stay apart from each other, not go to work, not complain about that, wear masks, etc. The virus wasn't that bad, but it's sort of self-perpetuating. You start instilling fear. Everyone sees people walking around with masks. It becomes scary. So as a society, we succumbed to this, and we allowed our wealth to be taken and transferred to this essentially group of companies, financial institutions, etc., that made so much money through this. And this is set a precedent that, as a business person who made this money, you would be silly to walk away from. There's some background to this. I sort of worked in WHO. WHO has changed over the last 20, 25 years greatly, in that most of the funding for WHO used to be, it was given to WHO. WHO did what it did with high burden diseases like malaria, tuberculosis, HIV. Now most of the money to WHO, and it's increased over the last 2 decades, is specified, which means WHO is given money to do a certain thing that the funder specifies. And that's about 80% of its funding now. And the other thing, there's been a large increase, is 20-25% of private money. There used to be almost none. So you have the global organization in charge of this, now heavily sponsored by organizations, individuals, and countries who are heavily invested in this pharmaceutical industry. And it's tied to what they tell it to do in terms of its work through the funding. So we have this business model, and we have our largest health institution and the other public-private partnerships around it heavily directed towards this area of instilling fear over outbreak risk, and then the paradigm of lockdown, mass vaccination, get your freedom back, which we saw in COVID, and which is very much planned through the pandemic agreements, the IHR amendments, etc., international health regulation amendments that were voted on in May, and the pandemic agreement of the WHO is still under negotiation. But this is what they set out as the aim, is essentially to do what we did in COVID over and over again.
Yep.
So to understand it, people need to cast their minds back to 2019 and think, were their lives dominated by an existential threat of dying tomorrow from a pandemic? And they weren't. Life was perfectly fine. We'd actually had less outbreaks over the last 5 years then than we had previously. If you look at the big databases like the Gideon database, that has all the outbreaks on Earth in it. And we have less deaths and so on because medicine is getting better. So we've got better at detecting them, but we're also getting better at managing them. So, but we have this situation where now there's a huge industry that is growing, and most of my colleagues are people in the global health industry that I work in, international public health. The salaries there and the careers there are now either in pandemics or in health and climate. So if you don't go along with the narrative, then, especially if you're young, you won't have a career, or it'll be very difficult to establish one. So they have a workforce of tens of thousands of people who have a pecuniary interest and a career interest in furthering this narrative as well. So yeah, we've built this pandemic industry, and it's, if you take out COVID, which was probably due to human manipulation, gain of function research in various labs, including Wuhan, then if you look at the World Bank or the G20, for instance, put out their high-level panel report saying, there's an annex in there, Annex D, I think, which has, it's headlined major outbreaks every 4 to 5 years over the last 2 decades. If you add them up, it has swine flu, which was less people died than normal flu in 2009. Then the rest of all their outbreaks altogether for the last 20 years were 26,000 people. That is, it's about 8 days, about a week of tuberculosis.
That's across the world.
Yeah, but we don't hear about tuberculosis. We just hear about these recurrent outbreaks. The actual burden of these outbreaks is tiny and is reducing over the last 20, 30 years. So it had been increasing, now it's reducing. The increase is almost certainly false. It's because we are detecting them and distinguishing them more from the background. So we have a situation where all the incentives are to push this narrative. We have the World Bank, the G20, the WHO itself pushing this, saying this is an existential threat, misrepresenting their own data, saying outbreaks are getting worse, that they may triple in the next decade, etc. Common sense says that's not the case. Common sense says we have never had a major pandemic on Earth that killed huge numbers of people that wasn't bacterial, and now we have antibiotics. The Spanish flu is a virus, but most people died from bacterial secondary infections. Even Anthony Fauci wrote a paper on that. There were large viral outbreaks in the past in Australia and Oceania due to measles and smallpox when European colonization first came. Same thing happened in the Americas. But that was a situation where you had large populations that had been isolated essentially for thousands of years from the rest of humanity. So they hadn't developed the genetic tolerance to these particular viruses. So it swept through. We don't have populations like that anymore. So it is highly likely that we will never see a major natural outbreak again. That's what history would suggest. That's what biology would suggest.
What about
we will see some, but we won't see we won't see bubonic plague type stuff or the stuff that they're talking about.
What about a planned outbreak?
Yeah, so you cannot. That's a different thing. So that can happen 2 ways. You can have people doing stuff like gain of function research, which is now being done on bird flu virus. I mean, it's almost certainly the reason we got COVID. And now we're doing the same thing for bird flu. And lab leaks are very likely quite common. So that can happen. You can stop that by stopping doing reckless research. The other possibility is an intentional manipulation of a virus as a weapon, as a bioweapon. And if that happens, as Australia or the US or whatever, you're not going to say, oh, we're at war, someone's attacking us, so we'll hand all our decision-making to a bunch of bureaucrats sitting in Geneva, many of whom come from the country that might be doing this. So, I mean, it would be insane. This would be a national issue that you would deal with yourself and with your close allies. So, again, what we're doing internationally, it doesn't make sense, either from a natural outbreak point of view or from a bioweapon, biowarfare point of view. It makes a lot of sense from a business point of view if you have a sort of amoral business code. that says make profit at all costs, even at the point of instilling fear and killing people. And this does kill people. COVID killed a lot of people. If you close down supply lines, even stop tourism in low-income countries, people starve to death. If you close markets, you stop day labor, millions of people will starve to death. There are millions of girls forced into child marriage, child labor increased. Schools closed for 1 or 2 years means another generation in poverty in these countries. So we have millions of people dead, and WHO even admits this, and there will be millions more from what we did in COVID. Leaving alone the great, there's over 100 million people additional in severe food deprivation, etc., who are on the edge of starvation in countries like Africa and in South Asia. This was all due to COVID. We knew this would happen. So this is what the business model does while it's concentrating wealth, because wealth comes from somewhere. So this is where we are, and people need to see it, and they need to see that they need to remember back to 2019 and then think, does any of this make sense?
One thing came to my mind was when you grew up in Foster, the aged care centre there at Foster used to care for people from about 50 years of age on, depending on their circumstance. They just might change their accommodation from single accommodation into communal accommodation. In the last 10 years, those people going into nursing homes, because of the changes we've made, are all mostly in their 80s and 90s. So instead of having a range of people within an aged care facility, you have a block of people who are over 85, 86, 87 years of age, and they all have comorbidities of some sort.
Yeah.
That's why they're there. So it just came to my mind that, of course, if a virus goes through there, whatever it may be, whether it's gastroenteritis, it will kill a lot of people at that age.
It will, although it doesn't have to kill as many as it did.
No.
The first thing you would do in that situation, if you're following basic public health, would be to ensure that these people have, good micronutrient status, vitamin D, vitamin K2, vitamin A, zinc, magnesium. This isn't, this isn't fringe medicine. This is basic medicine 101. There's a paper in Nature, which is the top scientific journal on earth, a year or so ago, pointing out, if everyone hadn't normalized vitamin D, we probably would have saved about 1/3 of COVID deaths.
Yeah.
But this was known. I mean, this is basic. This is because T cells,
why was it during the treatment for COVID for older people, they did not recommend antibiotics?
Yeah, which is pretty strange, because it's very common as an old person, if you get a viral respiratory infection, that you get a secondary bacterial infection on top of it. So with flu, we sort of assume that'll happen. There's no reason to think it wouldn't with COVID. So they didn't. It appears they didn't get antibiotics. It appears that, or they certainly were intubated at a very low threshold, which is highly dangerous for an old, frail person. That we didn't concentrate on things like vitamin. Vitamin D became a controversial issue. They were discussing it in the British Parliament and so on. T cells, which are the cells in our immune system that primarily target viruses, they need this to function.
Yeah.
And we know this. This is why, one of the reasons why you get colds more in winter, because you get less sunlight. Sunlight stimulates vitamin D production. It's not complicated. This is what every doctor knows, but somehow forgot. So if you normalize these micronutrients in these people, and it's not that hard to do that, then you would greatly reduce the mortality from viruses like this. But we didn't. And you can question why we didn't. And it is certainly understandable that people would say that is because it'll be hard to sell a vaccine if a lot of people were not dying. And it is hard to say. I don't think there's a definite sort of, we did this in order to do that. But I think there was there was certainly from the very beginning a strong interest in developing mass vaccination very quickly. And certainly in the US, and I assume in Australia, the emergency use authorization you need for that can only come into effect if you have no alternative effective treatments. That's the law. So
remove the
yes, you don't want to go down the path of proving something else because you will destroy your few $100 billion profit, which is a lot of money.
What you're saying, if you'd even said that 2 years ago, which was very similar to what I was saying or alluding to, you were a heretic. You completely lost it.
Yes.
I mean, there was a remnant of people who just stood against this whole thing and said, no,
yeah,
it smells really bad, and followed the money. And that proved to be the case. In fact, talking about money, it's breathtaking in this article that the WHO want $31.5 billion to fund what's become known as the Pandemic Prevention Preparedness Response. Could you give me your comments on that, please?
Yeah, so the aim is to have their budgeting is about, or the prediction is about 30 to 40 billion a year between the WHO and the World Bank, depending on which documents you're using. The entire WHO budget at the moment is about 3.5 billion. So this is getting to 10 times the current budget. It's 10 times what we spend on malaria. Malaria kills over 500,000 children, about 650,000 people every year, most of them children. Compare that with, I was saying, the G20 talked about their increasing pandemics the last 20 years. That was 26,000 plus another 100,000 for bird flu, for swine flu. So every year, far more kids die of malaria, which is preventable. Far more people die of TB. It's about 1.3 million every year. And the majority of them are young middle-aged adults, includes a lot of children. Yet these are the diseases that kill people. In Australia, it's ischemic heart disease, strokes, cancer. It's not pandemic. It's not acute infectious disease outbreaks. So, yeah. So
for the same reason they pulled ivermectin.
Yes, yeah, and there's very good. It wasn't out of nowhere that ivermectin was suggested. Ivermectin has antiviral properties. Like hydroxychloroquine's got anti-inflammatory properties, and one of the very early SARS-CoV-2 variants, COVID, they caused an acute inflammatory reaction in the lower respiratory tract. So an anti-inflammatory effect would work. There is a lot of trials on these. The trials that use prophylaxis and had them very early showed benefits. So the large trials there are a lot of trials that seemed designed to fail, where they gave either toxic doses of hydroxychloroquine, which one large trial did, or they gave hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin late, say in hospitalized patients, where you don't expect it to have much effect.
Yeah.
And these things work synergistically with enough vitamin D, enough, etc. So what we should have done is try to normalize all these things and add some drugs that make some sense that they would help a bit, rather than just giving a drug and hoping that will magically benefit.
How do we avoid the psyop that's going on now, for instance, around bird flu?
Yeah.
That will take us down the same track. And the people that were fearful before, they'll be fearful again. They'll do what the doctor tells them again. And we'll go through this whole process again. What can people like me do to combat that?
Yeah, it's difficult because the media, it makes sense here in the US. The media, it's pharmaceutical industries its main sponsor, its main advertiser. So the New York Times would die without the pharmaceutical industry.
Politicians in Australia are funded by the pharmaceutical industry.
Yes, politicians are. The
All the way.
ABC, I think, is not. I don't understand why the ABC has gone the way it has, because it is really, from what I've seen, one of the worst propaganda outfits now in the Western world.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so I mean, we can tell the truth that then there are, there are politicians like yourself who are trying to tell the truth and are trying to point out the obvious. And I think this is a time where we've got to undo our sort of party affiliations and follow people who obviously have integrity and are telling the truth rather than people who belong to a certain party. I, I think we sort of fight. I mean, to me, this is a much bigger battle. I think it's not just business. I think we're facing a situation where there is a sort of fascist mindset, essentially, corporate authoritarian mindset internationally, sort of embodied by some large financial institutions. The World Economic Forum is very clear on this. I mean, they talk about this is what they want. Stakeholder capitalism is essentially what we used to call fascism. It's a tying of corporate and state to control to control the economy, control people for the greater good. And
turns out to be their great good.
Yeah, and it's a very strong thing in public health. It always has been. The technocracy movement in the 1930s, it was public health that really drove European fascism very strongly as well. So it's not surprising that we're seeing public health leading this again. But I think that's what we're fighting. And this is, the push to stifle free speech, to censor, to only have a government narrative, etc. This is not democracy. It's nothing to do with the democratic principles that we thought in the past we stood for. It's a completely different thing. It's far more like, what we see in China or in communist countries or in the past in fascist dictatorships. And we have to sort of recognize it for what it is and get away from the party stuff and the left-right stuff in politics, which now is really outdated. I think we're fighting for, are we going to have a state that is run in this way, corporate authoritarian state, where everyone has to toe the line? Or are we going to have the sort of a state run the principles that we thought we had, where essentially people are sovereign and they have the ultimate right to decide what to do, and the government is there at their wishes for their purpose, and which is the way the US Constitution is written. I used to be very cynical of the US, being an Australian, but now I can really see why the Bill of Rights makes sense and why, you have to have free speech. And there are times when something like free speech is a problem, but it's a problem that is nowhere near as bad as what happens if you no longer have free speech and a government controls the narrative.
Amen.
Because they're human, and it will always lead to tyranny in the end. And it leads to the sort of lies that we saw in COVID, the sort of twisting of institutions. Yeah, we had the Therapeutic Drug Goods Administration Australia pushing out the vaccines and recommending them for pregnant women and not ever disclosing the data that they were sitting on, showing that, in the animal trials, which is the only data we had, there was a big increase in fetal abnormalities in rats in the vaccinated group compared to the control group. There was a reduction in implantation, so a reduction in successful pregnancy, etc. The only data we had was bad. And they would push this out. In the past, that would never happen. So we're going down this road, and it's very clear and it's very strong. You can't ignore it. It won't go away unless we sort of rethink our allegiances and support people who are just basically telling the truth. It's a bigger thing than the other issues that we have in politics.
Dr. David Bell, thank you so much for joining us today. and giving us nearly an hour of your time. We're going to, I'm going to actually give this whole interview to my parliamentary colleagues, especially those two that are doctors, and see how they respond this time. Because for 3 years, they've said nothing. In fact, both of them have been proponents of the injections and the whole process around COVID. David, thank you. At Foster this morning, it's 10 degrees. I don't know what the temperature is. I don't know what the temperature is in Texas, but
it's about 35, 38 and
wow.
about 100% humidity, which I like actually. But, yeah.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us today. All the
Thanks,
best.
Russell.
Thank you.